So I'd like to welcome everybody to our first political science discussion series event of the semester. So this is titled Hurricanes, Healthcare, and Heated Rhetoric, a virtual panel discussion hosted by the Department of History and Political Science at our School of Arts and Letters. We're also co-sponsored by the Middle Georgia State University Political Science Student Organization, as well as the Alpha Mu Zeta chapter of Pi Sigma Alpha, which is the National Honorary Society for Political Science. And just before we do get started, I want to do a little bit of introductions and things like that. First, I do want to tell you a little bit about our political science academic options here at Middle Georgia State University. So we offer a Bachelor of Science degree in Political Science, as well as the Bachelor of Science degree in Interdisciplinary Studies, as well as minors in Political Science, African Diaspora Studies, Environmental Policy Studies, Local Government Administration, Global Studies, and last but not least, pre-law, as well as a certificate in European Union Studies in cooperation with our friends across the University System of Georgia. So I'll go ahead and introduce our panelists today. First, we have Dr. John Hall, who's an associate professor of political science and has been a faculty member here at Middle Georgia State University for about 9 years, since 2015. And his doctorate in public policy and administration is from Auburn University over in Alabama. And then I am Dr. Christopher Lawrence. I'm the professor of political science and chair of the Department of Political Science at Middle Georgia State University. I've been here for about 12 years, since 2012. And my doctorate in political science is from Ole Miss, University of Mississippi, in Oxford, Mississippi. So what we'll do is kind of give you a little bit of orientation to how our event's going to work for those of you that have not attended one of our events before. We have selected a few topics for discussion. Dr. Hall and I have discussed these already. But we also want your questions as well. And if you do have questions as we go along, feel free to post those in the chat window, and we will keep an eye on those. And hopefully we'll be able to answer some of your questions as well as we progress. If you do have multiple questions, we do reserve the right to limit the number of questions we take per person. But obviously, if we don't get a lot of questions, we'll certainly take more than one per person. But at the same time, we do want to make sure that everybody that does have an opportunity to ask a question, if they do want to, please, as always, be courteous and civil to each other in the chat window. Bear in mind the responsibilities you have as a member of our community under the code of conduct and things like that. Some of the things we'll be talking about today include the recent storms, Hurricane Helene and Milton, as well as disaster response and how effective that's been and some of the issues related to that. An update on the status of abortion rights in the United States after the Dobbs decision. That when the Supreme Court overruled Roe versus Wade. And then we'll talk a bit about some things in the elections that are coming up, including some potential projections and predictions, issues of election security and fraud, recent campaign events, and trade and tax policy proposals as well. And while we're also talking about elections, don't forget that early voting is now underway here in Georgia. So if you're interested in voting before Election Day, you can now do so. We have some information posted on our social media about that, as well as around campus. So you probably got an email about it at some point. So we do encourage you to take advantage of your right to vote, because it is important that you do so if you are eligible, of course. Without too much further ado, we will proceed to our first question. And so the way this format is going to work is I will ask the questions, and then Dr. Hall will give an initial response. I may or may not follow up, depending on whether the spirit moves me to do so. Normally we have a couple more participants, but we were unable to wrangle as many people as we hoped. hopefully, nonetheless, we'll have a interesting discussion and go from there. And so, our first question is as follows. So, in the aftermath of two powerful hurricanes that severely impacted the American Southeast, so Helene and Milton, as I just mentioned, what can you tell us about the role of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, including, how long has FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, been around, and what does it do?
Thank you, Chris, for that introduction. I'd like to thank all of the students for being here. This is an intimate setting here. We're usually in the 40 student range, but this is going to be really nice as well. I don't want to put too much pressure on the students who are here for questions later, but there will be pressure. With that being said, I'm sure there's no one in the audience that has not heard of FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency. FEMA is the evolutionary byproduct of American policy on responding to overwhelming disasters that happen at the state or local level, bringing in the advantage and the power of the federal government to help when state and local governments literally cannot handle a particular situation. Now, in the early decades, if not almost centuries of the Republic, as we've discussed in class, the federal government wasn't overwhelmingly robust unless we were at war. We had something of an ad hoc system. It didn't really have an official name necessarily, but I'm going to fast forward through a couple of hundred years of just fixing things and making it up as we went along. In the early 1970s, a president you probably heard of by the name of Richard Nixon, basically he assembled a number of different disaster relief agencies that we had working in different areas, different specialties, and he put it under the, almost strangely, Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. Now, a little later in the 70s, another president, President Carter, would finalize the process. He would take all of the existing emergency agencies that were within the realm of the federal government, and he would bring them all together and call it FEMA. So FEMA was somewhat birthed in the late 1970s. Basically, the federal government was looking at the problem of natural disasters, or horrifically enough, man-made disasters, and wanting to streamline the process. If a city or even an entire state or region gets hammered by, say, a hurricane, and they cannot handle it, we wanted to make a more efficient system to help our fellow Americans, which we get in the Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act of 1988. FEMA is now in the Department of Homeland Security, and the whole country is basically broken up into 10 different sections so it can be more manageable. Now, having discussed a little bit about the history, what are the responsibilities of FEMA? If I were to ask everyone here, what does FEMA do? I'm pretty sure we could all come pretty close to the overall mission statement of FEMA. And in general, what FEMA does is helps to prepare for natural disasters and helps to recover from national disasters, and building up an extraordinary amount of policy expertise as they go along. They basically coordinate the awesome power of the federal government in the most efficient way possible. Now, we'll get to in a minute, there have been some problems with FEMA. FEMA may be one of the most scrutinized agencies within the federal government, and it makes sense why that is. FEMA is responsible for coming in and helping out when an unimaginable disaster has occurred. There could be hundreds or thousands dead. The public perception of FEMA not doing enough, not doing it fast enough, is almost always going to be there. FEMA has another unique characteristic, and that is that they have to have basically a request from state government. The federal government can't just come into Georgia or come into Western North Carolina. The governor of a state has to issue a declaration of a formal disaster, and then that kicks in FEMA, and then they can come in. If you have an image of FEMA bringing in hundreds of thousands of workers to come in and help rebuild and help get all of the destruction out of the way, that's not how FEMA works. FEMA has about 30,000 employees total in the agency. They have an overall budget of around $30 billion, which $30 billion obviously sounds like a lot to us. In terms of the federal government's expenditures, it's not that much compared to others. So FEMA basically streamlines the process of helping to recover from natural disasters or any disaster. The criticisms that have occurred in the past, again, FEMA, by the very nature of what it does, it's going to be under a microscope all of the time when it's in action. There have been some occurrences in the past where FEMA really did, just any way you look at it, drop the ball. I'm sure we're all familiar with Hurricane Katrina in 2005. There were multiple days that went by before literally anything was seen going into the Louisiana area. Also, Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico, 2017. You might be old enough to actually remember this. That was also seen as something of a ball getting dropped by FEMA. But in general, the responsibilities of FEMA are such that they're dealing with a policy area that is going to always have high emotions and high scrutiny. Now, in terms of FEMA funding, this might be something you have seen in the news recently, or especially a few weeks ago when the state of Florida itself got hit back to back by massive hurricanes. There have been conspiracy theory. I don't call it a conspiracy theory if it's just an outright lie, that FEMA is not properly spending money, that the federal government is taking money from FEMA and giving it to others. That's just not the case. FEMA is on the ground in Western North Carolina. FEMA is on the ground in Florida. FEMA is on the ground in Georgia. If you were to look at the Western North Carolina that was hit so hard by the flooding, there are a little over 4,000 FEMA operators there now. That's a large chunk of their overall inventory of personnel. There are also over 8,000 additional federal operators in the area. So when you think of FEMA, don't think of a group that brings in hundreds of thousands of people and helps fix everything as fast as possible. Think of a federal government agency that specializes in helping state and local governments recover when they don't have the resources to recover on their own. So in general, FEMA is usually relatively well funded. If their coffers are running low, Congress can, of course, appropriate additional funding in emergency situations. Congress just recently appropriated an additional $20 billion for FEMA. About half of that's already been spent. But FEMA is spending it and using it on the ground. FEMA spent about $2 billion over the last few weeks over the 2 hurricanes that we've had. FEMA is doing their best. Again, it is not a perfect agency, and it does have examples in the past of outright horrifying levels of ineptitude. But in general, it is a way of streamlining emergency response. Now, I could keep talking about FEMA for about the next 20 minutes, but I'm going to take this opportunity to stop and see if, Chris, if you want to add anything.
No, and apologies. I was having a big computer glitch there, so I tried to switch computers here. So no, I think that one question that people might have, maybe a little bit facetiously, is there have been people, Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, that were on social media saying that somehow the disasters, particularly in North Carolina, were human engineered or something like that. Is there any truth to the idea that the government could control a hurricane or steer it or anything like that?
That is a great question. Well, unfortunately, that's a great question. As any of my students know, I do not allow any of my personal opinion out ever, unless you're hanging out with me somewhere off campus, which does not happen. In this case, though, there is no way to sugarcoat this. Anyone who thinks that the United States federal government controls hurricanes and directs them to hit red states or blue states, that is moronic. Of course, no nation state on the planet has the technological capability to direct hurricanes and use them in a proactive manner. Having said that, nation states around the world have not only but have had for quite some time technological innovations that can affect the weather. Cloud seeding is something that is becoming a much more aggressively used technology, particularly in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, the UAE have successfully used cloud seeding. I'm not going to pretend to know the chemicals that go into it, but there is a way that you can go in with an airplane and spray a particular chemical and seed the clouds and encourage rain. And that is a promising technology that's been around for a while. But in terms of literally controlling hurricanes, I'm sure everyone who heard that recognized how shockingly stupid that was. I won't even use the word ignorant. That's borderline stupid. I'll leave it at, I don't know why a United States representative in the House of Representatives said that.
Okay. Yeah. So I think we'll move on to our next question. By the way, like I said before at the beginning of our discussion, if you have questions, particularly including follow-up questions, feel free to post those in the chat, and we will get to those when you post them. So moving on to another topic, we're couple years removed from the Supreme Court's landmark opinion in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization 2022 case that overturned Roe versus Wade. What is the current state of abortion rights in the U.S. and what did the court rule in that case and that sort of thing?
Great question. I'm sure this is another topic that all of the students here are somewhat familiar with. I'll go back in time just for a moment to give the backdrop. We have covered this slightly. We've covered this in class if you're in my American government. When it comes to the U.S. Constitution, it protects specific enumerated liberties that government cannot take away without due process most of the time. However, the framers of the Constitution, Madison and company, as politically genius as they were, they could not have any possible way of knowing all of the liberties that we would need protecting in the future. So the concept of substantive due process, something that also pops up in the Ninth Amendment, which we've covered, rights that we have that the government not only can't take away, they have to protect. It's one of the reasons government exists. There are rights that we have as Americans that are as humans that are protected by the Constitution that are not in the Constitution. By far, one of the biggest examples of this is privacy. Privacy is not mentioned in the Constitution. Technically, the federal government has no reason constitutionally to protect it. But in 1965, Griswold versus Connecticut, the court was asked in a case involving a prohibition of condoms to unmarried couples, does privacy exist? Is it a constitutionally protected liberty not in the Constitution, which would be supported by, among other things, the Ninth Amendment? And the court said yes. This was shocking. This was huge. This was one of the most important opinions in court history. Fast forward about 8 years, in 1973 in Texas, we have that very newly identified constitutional liberty of privacy being applied in a much more controversial way, in a way that will divide American politics for the next half century. The newly discovered right to privacy is applied to a woman's right to have an abortion. And in Roe versus Wade, 1973, the court recognized that abortion was a liberty protected for women under the right of privacy. And then a couple of decades later, in Casey, the court had another opportunity to address women's rights to abortion, and they upheld the fundamental right of a woman to have an abortion. This was in the early 1990s, under privacy, but they started to allow for a large number of state regulations that would deter women from getting abortions, making it harder. Fast forward to 2 years ago, and a liberty that the court had identified for 50 years in Dobbs versus Jackson, the court overturned Roe. It overturned Casey. Now, it's important to note, as I'm sure we all know, because we've discussed this in class, the Dobbs opinion does not prohibit abortion. It doesn't outlaw abortion. It literally takes women's rights to an abortion back in time to 1973. Instead of one federal government protecting constitutionally a right to an abortion covered by privacy, we're going to have 50 different answers to that. So now, and for the last 2 years, whether you will or will not have access to an abortion geographically is dependent on your state. So back to the original question, what is happening with abortion rights in America? It's been handed over to the states. What are the states doing? There are many ways you can look at this. In general, there are 13 states, which doesn't sound like a lot when there are only 50 total, but there are 13 states with outright bans. Now, some of them have exceptions for rape or incest or the health of the mother. Some don't. There are 13 states that you are just not going to get an abortion by law, and you could be charged with literal first-degree murder, or any doctor that is deciding to help you. It is very serious. This is not a misdemeanor in these states. Now, if you're familiar with the American Southeast, that's where we're talking. Those are the majority of those 13 states, except for things like Indiana, South Dakota. But if you are living, let's say, in Louisiana, geographically, you will have to travel almost 1,000 miles to get to a state that has limited access to abortion or more robust abortion rights. So in terms of where are abortion rights right now in America, it literally depends on where you are. Now, in addition to the 13 states that have outright bans, we have a number of states making up basically the rest of the Southeast that have extreme limitations on abortion rights. Georgia, in particular, has a law that was passed in the last 2 years that says you cannot have an abortion if the fetus's heartbeat is detectable. Now, fetal heartbeat will usually be detectable by modern technology at around 5 to 6 weeks. And in general, I would say 95 to 99% of women have absolutely no idea they're pregnant at 6 weeks. So at 6 weeks gestation, if the doctor can detect a fetal heartbeat, you cannot have an abortion in Georgia, in South Carolina, in North Carolina, in Florida. So heartbeat bills, as they're generally called, you can kind of look at them as a ban. They're practically a ban. So if you're in the American South, if you're in Georgia, for example, you're going to have a long trip. I would recommend a plane if you wanted to get to a state that had more advanced abortion rights for women. So in terms of where are abortion rights right now in America, again, it just depends on where you are. Now, there are several state courts that are overturning extraordinarily draconian abortion laws, claiming that they are against the state constitution. That just happened in Georgia. A couple of weeks ago, a district court judge in Georgia overturned Georgia's heartbeat bill, or heartbeat ban, if you will. But then it was immediately stayed by the state Supreme Court until they could get their hands on it. So that is now back. So again, it really just depends on where you are. Now, when you look at abortion restrictions, abortion bans, there are many who, and this is an intellectually sound argument by anyone, I would have to admit, if you're being intellectually honest, the federal government saying, let the states handle this. In many instances, that's attractive to a lot of people, regardless of the policy. So some would say, who cares if abortion rights have been extremely truncated, depending on where you are. There are a lot of issues that go along with limitations on abortion rights because there's really no way around it. Abortion rights are securely found within the policy area of healthcare for women. If you are not legally allowed to have an abortion, that is a limitation on a procedure that your doctor can or cannot perform. So these restrictions on women's healthcare can lead to women dying of preventable causes because in many instances, women in states, doctors in states, depending on what the exact details are surrounding that pregnancy, many doctors don't really know exactly what they can do. And they do know, however, in most states that ban it, if they take part in an illegal abortion, they are going to state prison. So limitations on women's health care, that's one of the major elements here. There are also those who would argue that this is a matter of equality, something that had it been passed, the Equal Rights Amendment might not have allowed. And that is the fact that women get pregnant, men don't. This is a limitation on the healthcare rights of women, not men. That can be seen as an equal protection clause issue. And then there's one other element. Back to that original story. I'm trying to check the clock. I feel like I've been talking for a long time. With regard to privacy, which was the foundation for abortion in 1973, that was struck down. Now, privacy wasn't, but an incredibly important politically charged liberty for women covered by privacy, that was taken away. The guarantee was taken away. It was overturned. Some would look at other rights that are guaranteed by privacy and wonder, are they next? So that's a whole other policy area. The court, in its opinion, I think it was on 3 separate occasions, Justice Alito specifically said, we are not attacking privacy. But again, you never know. So those are some of the issues that might be coming. I'll stop there. I was about to get into the weeds on precedent setting and what is and is not constitutionally permissible according to the court in terms of overturning precedent. But the court clearly found that in this case, overturning precedent was not going to be a violation of American jurisprudence. One of the major variables involved is a phrase the court uses that we deal with other rights like this. And it has to do with if there's a right that would be maybe covered by the 9th Amendment, that is protected, that we have a guaranteed right to, that's not mentioned in the Constitution, the court looks at it and wonders, is this right? Whatever it is it historically embedded in the nation's history? Is it something that is part of American historical political culture? Is it required for good government, for democratic government? And the court here, when they looked at abortion, they felt that it did not have the historical precedent. It did not connect itself to the very functioning of liberal democracy to the point where they could not break that precedent. And now I will stop.
Okay, so just, thanks, John. So just to follow up on that, I know there's been some discussion on the campaign trail by Kamala Harris and perhaps others about maybe passing some sort of federal law to restore Roe or something like that. What are the is that the sort of thing that could legally be possible, and or would it take a Supreme Court decision essentially to kind of revisit Dobbs and go back the other way to actually, in effect, truly restore Roe?
Great question. The Harris campaign, being the nominee for the Democratic presidential ticket, obviously, if you're familiar with the Democratic Party, they're very much in favor of women's rights to an abortion. The Harris campaign is saying, promising, this is a major campaign promise that she has formally made, that if president, she would sign a bill into law guaranteeing at the federal level a right for all Americans to have access to abortion. Now, again, hopefully all of my students are thinking right now what I want you to be thinking. Presidents have nothing to do. Presidents don't make that law. Congress does. She did stipulate if Congress were to send me a bill that would make abortion rights federally guaranteed, she would, of course, sign it. So that's relative. That makes sense. That checks out with the Democratic National Party platform. Now, the Trump campaign, that's an interesting area. Former President Trump obviously is the reason why Roe was overturned. Not directly necessarily, but he put 3 U.S. Supreme Court justices on the bench. He had this extraordinary opportunity. Most presidents in one term do not get the opportunity to put 3 Supreme Court justices on the bench. But he has been, to the best of his ability, kind of shying away from this issue or kind of trying to split it down the middle. President Trump recognized, the Republican Party recognizes something that I used to say for decades, that if abortion were to ever be overturned, if Roe versus Wade were to be overturned, that could be a nightmare for the Republican Party. You might wonder why. Most Republicans politically are against abortion. The reason it could be a nightmare, and this is what the Republicans are experiencing now, is from 1973 to 2022, over a half a century, Republicans had this extraordinarily powerful issue, abortion. It got millions of Republicans out the door to go vote on election day because there are many what we call single issue Republican voters. For over a half a century, the Republican Party had this lightning rod in abortion. It is kind of one of those things, at least in terms of political electoral success, be careful of what you wish for. The second Roe was overturned, Republicans across the nation, many of them, were ecstatic. They were happy. But then in the aftermath, you lost that key issue that energized your base and got millions of single issue voters out to vote every single election. So President Trump, the Republican Party, they recognize the political electoral difficulty here. They realize that many women who make up the majority of our population are not fans of Roe being overturned. And Republicans are and will probably continue to be for a while worried that women will try to repay them at the voting booth. So President Trump is sticking with a relatively consistent line. He's saying, when asked, that what his court at the time, what the Supreme Court did was extraordinarily constitutionally sound. It didn't ban abortions. It simply gave back to the states the power to dictate whether they would or would not allow them. Having said that, he has gone out, and this is, I was actually kind of surprised by recently, saying that some states have gone a little too far with the abortion ban. And he said if reelected, he would work with, obviously he's referring to red states, Republican-held states, that are trying to pull back on their aggressive abortion bans. However, the problem with that is there are literally no red states with Republican parties in those states trying to pull back anything. So President Trump's trying his best to kind of drive down the middle of the road on this. He knows this is a volatile issue.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Hall. So on our topic of presidential candidates and things like that. We've got just a few weeks away from our November 5th general election. Early voting is already underway, as I mentioned before, and of course, as you can see on the sticker that I'm wearing. So, what races around the country? Obviously, the White House race, but perhaps others. Are you kind of keeping an eye on to perhaps? I guess in terms of the ones that are going to make the most difference in the outcome of the election, and what I wouldn't ask that you prognosticate perhaps here, but nonetheless, are there any early signs of um, either one party having an advantage or another in, say, the Senate races, the House race, or even the presidential contest?
That's a great question. First and foremost, and we're also, did you ask about the safety and security of American elections?
I will ask about that as a kind of a follow-up. Yeah.
Perfect. First and foremost, obviously, the most publicly visible election coming up this election cycle is between Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. And that, as of right now, is incredibly close and will probably stay incredibly close. The last data I saw on polling, this was actually from, I'm actually looking at it now, 270 to win. Vice President Kamala Harris nationwide actually has almost a 2-point lead over President Trump. Former President Trump. I was shocked to see that, but it's going back and forth, and it's all within the margin of error. One of the elections that I'm looking at most intently, it's actually not even a Senate race. We can look at that in a moment. It's actually the Alabama second. And again, back to my students, we've covered this in class. When I go over gerrymandering, I always use the Alabama seventh. It is the greatest example of a gerrymandered district. It's a Republican state. State legislatures controlled by the Republican Party. And again, Democrats and Republicans gerrymander. I'm not saying anything negative about Republicans. But the Alabama 7th Congressional District is an incredibly Democratic district where the legislature's effectively packing in a lot of Democrats into one district, so that the Republican Party has 6 of Alabama's 7 House seats and the Democratic Party has 1. However, the court has basically taken itself out of the discussion, declaring partisan gerrymandering a political question, and they're not going to get involved. But the the Voting Rights Act of 1965 still exists. You cannot gerrymander congressional districts in a way that is purposefully or seen as purposefully negative to a particular group based on race, particularly minorities. So what we've seen is an extraordinarily gerrymandered congressional districts in Alabama. The court actually, based on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, forced the state of Alabama to redraw one of their gerrymandered districts. So, short story, even longer, instead of 1 Democratic district in Alabama for the House of Representatives, there's a possibility that there is going to be 2. Now, that's neither here nor there. It's neither good nor bad, but that to me is what I have been focusing on, because it's one of the rare examples of the court getting involved with partisan gerrymandering. In this case, again, specifically defending the Voting Rights Act of 65, not attacking gerrymandering itself. I'll give you a second. I don't want to take up all the air.
Sure. So yeah, like you said, the polls do seem to show a bit of a narrow lead for Harris, right? Of course, I guess the key question is, right, is she winning in the places she needs to win, right? Is it, as I'm sure your students are aware, I'm sure you're aware, we have the joy, the excitement of having the Electoral College, and so where does she stand in some of the key states like, say, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia, that sort of thing.
Great question. I'm looking at that now. I had this in my head, but I want to make sure I get everything correct. There are certain areas where she's doing well, certain areas where she's not. As of right now, the last data I saw, I think former President Trump has just above a 2-point lead in the all-important state of Georgia. That 2-point lead now does not mean anything. Trust me, by election day, many things can change. But as of right now, President Trump, and quite consistently for months now, President Trump has had a very small but a consistent lead over Georgia. That would be huge. That's 16 electoral votes that he did not get the last time. But if we go up to the American Midwest, that's where we're going to see the Rust Belt. That's where we're going to see a lot of states that basically determine who presidents are. We're even in Wisconsin for the most part. If you look at Pennsylvania, basically even. If you look at Michigan, Vice President Harris has about a 1-point lead, but that's within the margin of error. Nevada, also shockingly important recently in terms of presidents and the U.S. Senate. She is at about a 1-point lead in Nevada. North Carolina, another important state. President Trump has about a 1-point lead. In Arizona, President Trump has about a 2-point lead. So as of right now, all of the swing states are swinging, doing what they do. And it just really depends on which one you're in and what day or what week it happens to be. Again, if you look at aggregate figures nationwide, 340 million Americans, Vice President Kamala Harris in polling data has about a 2-point lead. But as we all know, we don't have a national election for president. We count that number up just because it's interesting and we know how to count, but we don't have one national election for president. We have 50 state elections for president. And where it stands now, flip a coin.
Yeah, great. So you alluded to this already a little bit. There have been a lot of discussions about the obviously going back to the 2020 election, the integrity of the election, the accuracy of vote counting, whether there was fraud, whether there were people that were not entitled to vote that were voting, that sort of thing. What does the evidence suggest? If we look at the hard evidence, not the speculation, not the rhetoric, but what is the evidence to support or not support these allegations? How much fraud is there really in American elections? Is there any fraud at all? Is there enough fraud to really make a difference? That sort of thing.
Great question. I'm going to start with a version of that question. Is there significant voter fraud, in-person voter fraud or non-in-person voter fraud in the United States? Absolutely not. We have, ironically, when you look at how much polling figures on this have dropped since the 2020 election, we have one of the cleanest, safest electoral processes in the world. Now, I want to point this out also. If you were to go back in time about 120 years, and then maybe a little bit more to where you can get yourself before what we call the progressive era, American elections were hilariously corrupt. The political parties, not state governments, were in charge of printing ballots. They were in charge of counting the votes, political parties, prior to the progressive era. A lot of these changes were because of the progressive era. My students might be getting sick of me talking about the progressive era, but trust me, you will get sicker. I will talk about the progressive era to the end of the semester. It's that important. But in the past, we had, as many other liberal democracies, we had some pathetically unjust and corrupt elections. Not now, and not for generations. The mountains of data that we collect on local, state, and federal elections is immense, and there are simply no examples, absolutely none, of widespread in-person voter fraud. I keep saying widespread. There's no evidence of any significant voter fraud in this country. It's important to note, especially if any of you who were around after the 2020 election and saw what would happen with the integrity of American elections in terms of the rhetoric and the lies. After 2020, there's this just image of voter fraud being almost comically common, and it's not. It literally just does not exist. Every single incident of voter fraud that has ever been accused is investigated by federal and state agencies. If you were to take part in voter fraud, if you were to vote for your Meemaw, but you voted the way you wanted, you would be investigated. It's a felony, and it's for one vote. We have, again, something that we should be proud of, one of the safest, cleanest, and least corrupt elections in the world. And there are many reasons for that. One of the major reasons is the decentralization of our elections. Again, something we've covered in class. Who's in charge of elections? States. Who's in charge of elections in the state of Georgia? Georgia's in charge of elections in the state of Georgia within constitutional boundaries. The decentralization of American elections makes it what many in federal and state agencies consider to be almost an uncorruptible system of elections, because we don't have one national entity that's running one national election. We have 50 states. We have tens of thousands of local governments and local geographic areas for voting. Anyone here who's gone to vote, you will know what I'm talking about right now. The decentralization of American elections at the state and local level makes it almost impossible to effectively pull off a nationwide successful voter fraud. I have given this as an assignment to students before. I give you unlimited financial resources. Go fix an American election. It's impossible to do when you think through the variables. If you go vote, you're probably going to go in your precinct, and the people who are there working, the volunteers, one of them is your second grade, English teacher. One of them is someone you used to date back in high school. I mean, these are locally controlled elections, and you have local populations dealing with local volunteers. I could talk about this for hours, and I want to make sure I don't get off on a tangent here, but the American electoral election system is incredibly safe, incredibly clean. There's one piece of research that covered about 15 years of elections. This is in the early 21st century. Looking at federal, state, and local, there were literally billions of votes that they were exploring for as a multi-year project. And with billions of votes being studied, there were, I think, 15 examples of possible voter fraud. If you're familiar with statistics, 15 possible examples of voter fraud out of over 2 billion votes, that is basically zero. So again, I would scream it from the rooftops. America should be proud of our voting system. It can still be improved upon, of course, but in terms of corruption, it simply doesn't exist. And every instance where it is accused of existing, it is investigated to the fullest extent. If you were to look at the 30 plus specific instances the former Trump administration brought up into federal and state courts after the 2020 election, literally every one of them, except I think one, was dismissed because it had no validity. There was absolutely no evidence. There's never been any evidence. Again, it's not something that's just clean and safe and non-corrupt. It's something Americans should be proud of.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Hall. I think the only thing I would add to that is, and you touched on this, but there are a lot of mechanisms, there are a lot of things that maybe people are not necessarily familiar with, that exist to assure integrity, right? There's this impression, for example, that I can just sort of, well, if I just get a copy of a sample ballot and I mail that in, that's going to count, right? It doesn't work, right? They keep records of which absentee ballots they sent out. They match it to an envelope when it comes back, right? They know who they sent them to. They know who they didn't send them to. They're going to catch you if you try to vote on election day and you already mailed in a ballot. There are records of these things, right? Ballot stuffing, you would have to have, insider kind of access to be able to do that sort of thing. And there are processes and procedures in place to make sure that doesn't happen at scale, right? Yeah, you could probably sneak in a ballot or two, and maybe get away with it. But of course, a ballot or two probably isn't going to win an election.
Exactly.
And is it really worth the risk, right? Is the other thing, right? Because when it is found, it is prosecuted, and people have ended up in prison for sometimes you know I wouldn't say necessarily innocent mistakes, but certainly in cases where maybe they should have known better and tried to vote, or there have been people prosecuted and sent to jail for you know, voting when they weren't eligible because they were a felon and they were in a state where that was felons were disenfranchised, or where and in the circumstances where non-citizens have voted and been caught, there have been cases where they've been sent to jail for quite a long time, and so the certainty of punishment here is quite a lot higher than you might appreciate, right? Yeah, there are a lot of crimes you can get away with in America, but election fraud is, there are so many records that it's hard to get away with. And there are people, the other thing to bear in mind is, of course, there's also a lot of people out there that are motivated to find it because they want to find evidence of it. I mean, there are literally bounties out there for anybody that can prove that there was widespread election fraud. And so, and they've never had to pay up, right? Because it's just not there, right? I mean, you could be rich if you could find some widespread election fraud, and yet it hasn't happened, right? So, um, and then of course, as Dr. Hall points out, right, there's the whole other issue of you know the fact that so much of this stuff is done at the state and local level where people know the voters. People, when I worked as a poll worker about 20 years ago in New Orleans, within a few elections, within a few times of working at the polls, you start to recognize who the people were that oh yeah, that's so and so, he was here in the primary, or that sort of thing, right? And so if a bunch of people had shown up that you'd never seen before, particularly in an election where it was a low turnout election, it would have been a little suspicious, right? Even before you start to get into questions of, okay, well, do they even have IDs? Do they even show up on the voter roll? The basic things that are done to protect, the integrity of elections, or if the number of votes in the system was way off of the number of people that checked in, right? There are things that can be done to make sure that. And the other thing is, right, if you're going to go and impersonate somebody else, you better hope they're not going to show up and vote after you did go and impersonate them, because I guarantee you they're going to raise a stink if they show up and they're told, "Oh yeah, you already voted." That will be investigated. Trust me. And there have been cases where it was because of a clerical error, because somebody, like somebody's, father or something with a similar name had come to vote or something like that. And it ended, there have been investigations where, as a result of just clerical errors. So if you imagine somebody deliberately doing that, right? It'd be pretty foolhardy to, if you just showed up at, the Sumter County Courthouse in Georgia and decide, oh yeah, I'm going to pretend to be Jimmy Carter, right? That's not going to work.
I'm glad you
Um,
brought that up because, in the interest of intellectual honesty, and I'll make sure I always am, when I say that there is no voter fraud, it does exist. In this upcoming election, out of maybe 150, 160 million votes cast, there will be viable examples of voter fraud that will be investigated and they will turn up as voter fraud. But here's the thing: the vast majority of those, and I mean they are in single digits, maybe into the teens, 20s, the vast majority of those are mistakes. Like you said, they're
mhm.
errors. They're people who make mistakes. Now, another element that I don't consider voter fraud, although it's shockingly important, that we need to make sure to distinguish between voter fraud is social media. You have foreign state actors like Russia, China, North Korea. This was very big in the 2020 election. In terms of social media and bots that are just mass producing um, uh, lies or information that's not real, that is a serious issue. But that's not the same as voter fraud. That's more of an electronic global social engineering. But that is a serious problem that does need to be dealt with. And the Defense Department and the intelligence agencies of the federal government are working on that. But that again is not voter fraud. So
Great. So a couple of things. First thing is, again, a reminder: if you have questions, follow-up questions, particular, or just your own questions, feel free to ask those in the chat. We're always happy to take
ooh,
those.
just check the chat. There are no questions.
I have not seen any so far. That doesn't mean that there won't be any in the future. So we always want to encourage people, unless there's something broken in Teams. I guess it's always possible people just the chat is broken, but I hope not. I guess the other thing is this a topic you want to continue talking about? I mean, we do have a couple other potential follow-up questions, or we can move on to another topic. It's up to you.
Oh, again, this is without a doubt one of what I consider to be one of the more important topics, mainly because of the excessive disconnect between
Mhm.
reality and um, what some people think or believe or feel. The fact that, and again, I don't care if you vote Democrat, Republican, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump. This is not a political issue. It's a fact. Former President Donald Trump drove this narrative and to this day drives this narrative. Not to mention, there are many Republicans, the current vice presidential candidate, who, when asked in public, will you admit that the 2020 elections were legal and fair? They still sidestep that. This is serious. If you poll Democrats, this makes sense because again, Democrats not supporting Donald Trump, about 80 7% of Democrats, in general, have strong faith in our fair electoral process. That number is down at about 50% if you ask Republicans. Now, think about that. 50% of the Republican Party does not believe that we currently have fair democratic elections. That is shockingly dangerous. When you have, what I'm going to just off the top of my head here, let's say 50 million Americans who vote and pay taxes, who look at our electoral process and think it is crooked. That is a problem. That is not a problem that is sustainable. That is not a problem that we will be able to continue for decades and decades without rectifying. You cannot have that many Americans think that the electoral process is crooked, especially when it's not. So that's something we would have to hopefully we never have to deal with. But that's something that scares me. 50-ish million Republican voters who seriously question the integrity of our electoral system. That's terrifying. That's dangerous, potentially.
So just to kind of follow up on that and maybe think a little more strategically political sciencey about this, right? If the Trump campaign, or if any campaign, right, is out there saying, your vote's not going to count, your votes are, the system's corrupt, your vote doesn't matter, all that good stuff, right? Is there a risk then that they might actually make it a self-fulfilling prophecy where their supporters decide, hey, if the system's rigged against Trump, maybe I should just stay home, right? Why bother if, they're just going to steal the election from my candidate anyway?
Great question. That's one of the elements of this, the rigged election, that is lasting this long, that I just don't understand from a political perspective. If I were a Republican strategist, I would be screaming from the rooftops, please, let's stop this narrative. Republican strategists know that this is not true, that our system is fair and just. We are not corrupt in terms of our elections. But yeah, it can backfire on you if you constantly say how pointless it is. Then you can have it. This specifically happened, I believe it was in 2020. When was Herschel Walker running against? Was it 2022?
2022, yeah.
I think it was in the runoff. President Trump came to Georgia, and the language he used was like you're saying, this is so rigged, Georgia's rigged, despite the fact that it's a Republican governor, Republican Secretary of State, that you started to see Republicans pulling back from the election, and then Republican strategists flooded in saying, well, no. It's not that. We want all Republicans to vote. But yeah, it's a dangerous, in many directions, politically and theoretically, it's dangerous to have a recognizable former president of the United States who is constantly denigrating our electoral process. If our electoral process was corrupt, I would be the biggest fan of people who brought it up. But in this case, it's just not. And again, this is nothing against President Trump, the Republican Party's policies. These are just facts. The 2020 election, which he then and to this day claims was corrupt and stolen from him, it wasn't the first time. If you go a few months back into the Republican primary elections of 2020, every state that he lost the Republican primary, you're never going to believe what he said. It was rigged. Every state that he won, he never said it was rigged. So you do not have to be a master of human nature to recognize there's a pattern here. If he loses, he says that it was stolen. And if he doesn't, he doesn't. Again, nothing against President Trump, actually kind of a little bit against President Trump. Nothing against the Republican Party or their policies. These are facts. He has not hidden this. I'm not judging anyone who votes for President Trump or who votes for Vice President Kamala Harris, but these are facts. This has been dangerous. This purposeful and completely fraudulent push to suggest that American elections are not clean.
And just to kind of follow up on that, right? We've also seen sort of the same issue with, rhetoric about, like I said, absentee voting, early voting, that sort of thing as well. Where on the one hand, again, candidates, Trump in particular, have gone out and said, this is all corrupt. This is all, don't throw away your vote by voting absentee, whatever. And then, you have Republican strategists turning around and say, well, whoa, wait a minute, we want you to make your vote. We want you to vote early. We want to, make sure we're getting as many votes as we can. So, so again, there is this counterproductive sort of
absolutely
dimension to this, and it would be, certainly ironic if Trump were to lose a narrow election, a winnable election. I think everybody agrees that he could very well win this election.
No, absolutely.
But one of the reasons why he might lose this election is because of his own questioning of the electorate and
That would be
and the
horrible.
integrity of the vote. And that's not like I said before, I'm not sure that politically it's the most sound strategy, even though perhaps it does feed his ego a bit.
And,
Not to put too fine a point on it.
and
So we have a follow-up question in the chat, if we want to deal with that. So, um, or maybe we got phone calls we can answer. Either
sorry.
way.
Um, yeah,
Well, I need to check if mine's muted too. Yes, it
that's,
is. Okay, so is there anything as citizens? So this is a patience in the chat asking, is there anything as citizens that we can do to help with the issue of integrity or insecurity in our voting system?
great question. I can answer this two ways. First of all, if you're asking, is there anything we can do to make our system less insecure? I would say, no, it's not insecure at all. It's very secure. If you're saying, and I think this might be what you mean, is there anything we can do to change the rhetoric, to change the narrative? Um, Always. And that would be if you encounter someone in your life, if you are having that classic Thanksgiving dinner and you've got all of your different family members and it's time to fight over politics and football. If you're talking to someone that you know, or even a stranger or an acquaintance who is, you're talking politics and they're talking about the fraudulent electoral process that we have, politely, respectfully tell them, no, we don't. Tell them to investigate these claims of fraud. Tell them that you will agree with every word they're saying and do anything that they ever tell you to do again. Trust me, you're safe. If they can go find examples of widespread fraud, they can't find it. So in terms of what can we do to help with the issue of insecurity in our voting system from the perspective of voters who may incorrectly think it's not one of the greatest electoral systems in the world, talk to them. Anyone who is, it's hard to say conspiracy theory because sometimes conspiracy theories turn out to be true. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is a lie. This is a manufactured, purposeful lie. It's not a conspiracy. It's incorrect. But having said that, great question. I would also point out one of the dangerous elements here. It's lying, and if you lie about something that's not true, it can breed further insecurities down the line. Take for example Georgia. This is something that you can set your clock to. It's going to happen. I have no idea who is going to win the state of Georgia. Former President Trump, current Vice President Kamala Harris, but I know this will happen. Early or maybe throughout the day as the votes come in, it's going to be tight. You'll probably see former President Trump take a lead, maybe even a significant lead. But then later in the evening, you're going to see the Kamala Harris surging back with hundreds of thousands of votes. Now, when you create an environment where you artificially make people think that the environment is corrupt, it leads those people to see other sources of corruption that may not exist. I'm going to make my point here if anyone's wondering, what am I talking about? Democrats disproportionately vote early. By Georgia law, we don't allow ourselves, you could make the argument, we probably should, we don't count the early votes, no matter, there could be 1 million early votes. We do not count them before the election. We count them, when all of the other votes are coming in. So you're going to get this in a lot of close states, particularly Georgia. You'll see President Trump maybe close or winning, maybe even winning significantly. And then as the night gets later, as we get closer to 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, midnight, you're going to see this massive surge of Democratic voters for Kamala Harris. And then you will have people look at that and say, wait a minute, that is a clear indication of fraud. President Trump was winning, he was winning, he was winning. And then at the very last minute, you get all these Democratic votes out of nowhere. They're not out of nowhere. Those were the early votes that we cannot count until the day of the election. So when you create an environment that is artificially corrupt, it leads to people seeing that same artificial corruption in other areas. Hope I didn't go off on too far of a tangent there, and that made sense.
No, and just to add to that, the other thing, of course, is also that the larger counties also tend to report later, just as a
Yep.
nature of because they have more votes to count, and so you may see again that pattern, and part of the reason why you see that pattern is that the small counties may have two, three, four voting precincts, and once all those are in, they're in. That's it, right? There aren't going to be more votes from those counties. Whereas if you're in say Fulton County or Cobb County or one of those counties that has you know dozens of precincts, right? Plus the early vote, right? It is going to take a lot longer for all of those to get in, and those precincts tend to be bigger, and they're going to return more votes. And of course, as we know, as I'm sure your students know, right? One of the things that definitely goes together is urbanization and voting for Democrats, right? And so more urbanized areas tend to be more Democratic, more rural areas tend to be more Republican. And while it's certainly not we're not going to say that certainly there are lots of Democrats in rural Georgia and there are lots of Republicans in Atlanta, but the ratio, the share is definitely more Democrats in urban areas, and so again that's another reason why you see that pattern as well. And while there are you know so definitely right, that pattern, and that pattern shows up in every election. It's not necessarily a result of corruption or as Dr. Hall points out. So I guess our last election integrity question, what would happen if there has been some discussion about the possibility that Congress, or perhaps maybe not even Congress, but some uh, rogue counties and things like that refuse to certify the election. What would be
Great.
the impact of that on the outcome?
Well, if you're looking at it from the perspective of Congress, nothing would happen really. If when you look at the electoral votes, um, by law, Congress has to convene January 6th. Keep in mind, just to give you the calendar, it's in early November that we're voting. And it's going to take a couple of days for all states to finish tabulating all those votes. Trust me, it's not just Georgia and swing states that take a minute to count all the votes. Alabama takes just as long. It's just that we're able to call Alabama immediately. California, we're able to call quickly. But by January 6th, the new Congress has to convene in on Capitol Hill. Keep in mind that the new members who were just reelected, and if it's the House, all 435 have to be reelected. If it's the Senate, a third have to be reelected every 2 years. So on January 3rd, the new Congress is sworn in. On January 6th, the new Congress meets. The Senate and the House will go into Capitol Hill, and they will count the electoral votes from their states that were sent. It's kind of a formality. We know who won, but it is a formality that occurs. And when counting those votes at the end of the day, the president of the Senate is nominally responsible for declaring the winner. Um, there isn't any magic here. There are no wizards here. There's nothing special that the Senate and the House are doing. They're counting votes that they already know the results for, and then the president of the Senate says, yes, it's done. And of course, the president of the Senate would be Kamala Harris. In that case, not much would happen. It would be somewhat anticlimactic. We saw the possibility of this becoming an issue in 2020 on the January 6th riots. But to his credit, the vice president at the time refused to not approve or certify that election. Now, there are a lot of other scenarios that can lead to a possible headache in terms of the results of a particular election, particularly for president. If you were to ask yourself, out of the 358 electoral votes, you need 270 to win. What if one candidate got 270, the other candidate, excuse me, what if one candidate got 269 and the other candidate got 269 somehow? What if there's a tie and you don't have anything to certify? We have constitutional mechanisms to fix that. We'll cover this in class. The House would be responsible for basically voting on the president, and the Senate would have the same responsibility for the vice president. Now, when voting, if this tie were to ever occur, the House would not vote as 435 people. They would vote as a state. So even if the Democratic or Republican Party had a majority in the House, if we ever got to a House vote because we had a tie in the Electoral College, that majority might not hold up because we're only voting as 50 states in the House. So there are constitutional mechanisms if that were to occur. Other certification variables that might come up mostly deal with the state level. It's the Secretary of State that is principally responsible for certifying those electoral votes before then sending them off to DC for that January 6th count. I've gone over several different possible variables here. I'm going to take a minute and stop now to see if you want to redirect the direction.
Okie dokie. Sure. So let's see. So we have another question from the chat. So this is from Joseph in the chat. Is there a way that the government can prevent something like January 6th again? Presumably the January 6th riots and not just having counting of electoral votes. Maybe not the same situation, but a large mass of people charging towards a prohibited area.
Great question. Yes, absolutely. Fundamentally, that question you just asked, great question. You could reword it and say, is there a way that the government could prevent crime? Because what occurred on January 6th was a criminal act. Was it a treasonous act? You can make that debate all day long, but absolutely have more security there. Have the District of Columbia, have the National Guard if you need. Hopefully we don't encounter a point in our future where that occurs again. Again, this is one of parts of my American government lecture on the president that's actually altered. I used to very proudly say America, one of the most excruciatingly impressive things our democratic experiment has done has been the peaceful transfer of political power for 230 years. That technically has a blemish now, January 6th. It was an incredibly incompetent blemish. Those who charged the Capitol, they weren't exactly creating a new government, or they weren't revolutionaries. They weren't insurgents. They broke into Congress, and many of them, their claim to fame was going into offices and taking selfies. This wasn't exactly an impressive effort at overthrowing democratic government, but great question. There is absolutely a way to avoid that in the future, and that would be with more security personnel, more police. I'm glad this did not happen, but to show how serious January 6th was. I was surprised. I'm very happy that this did not happen, but I was surprised that security didn't start shooting. I mean, that could have happened. This was not expressing yourself through First Amendment liberties. This was criminal activity. The best way to avoid that is with more security and possibly trying to be a little bit better prepared for it. Great question.
Okay, thanks. So also on the presidential race, this past week, Donald Trump just held a women's issues town hall here in Georgia and an interview with the Chicago Economic Forum, along with several rallies across the country, as well as that. While Kamala Harris sat for an interview with radio podcast host, I apologize if I mispronounce his name, Charlemagne the God, and is planning an interview with podcaster Joe Rogan. Why did they participate in these events instead of having another presidential debate? And did we as voters actually learn anything from these events as a result?
Great question. I have to admit, I'm going to age myself. I'm going to sound very old. I never heard of Charlemagne the God. I'll definitely look into that. Heard of Joe Rogan. Why were former President Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris going to newer, more to Gen X, more alternate forms of news as opposed to the mainstream news? The number one strategy would be to gain access to possible voters that would not have heard them had they been on mainstream. So there's an obvious strategy. I believe, this is my theory. I haven't talked to her, but I think I know why Kamala Harris, I think she went on The View. She followed that up with one of my favorites, Howard Stern, followed that up with Stephen Colbert, and then went to Fox News. She was hitting an eclectic array of mainstream media and a little bit less mainstream. The possibility of Kamala Harris going on Joe Rogan, that will be the single highest rated Joe Rogan podcast, I think, ever. And I would look forward to it. Kamala Harris and, well, with President Trump going to Chicago and having an interview with the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg, not exactly a conservative think tank there, which did become contentious. And Kamala Harris, her interview on Fox News became a little contentious. It got a little sporty. Why they were going to these not alternative news sources, but less mainstream. was to get eyeballs on them that they would not have gotten otherwise. Now, while they have reached out into different directions going into the home stretch, it appears that the Trump administration and Republican advisors are going more in the direction of safe media. They're sticking more to conservative news outlets. Kamala Harris, the possibility of her going with Joe Rogan, that would be her still, stepping outside of her comfort zone. But again, the number one reason for doing that would be to gain access to people who would not have heard you otherwise. It's risky. It can have a high payoff, but I don't think it's an anomaly. I think it'll continue as we move forward. But yeah, I think why are they purposely going for less mainstream outlets to gain access to more possible voters? Why are they not having another vote? Another debate. Great question. And unless something has changed, I don't think President Trump's camp wants another one. If I'm wrong, I'm almost positive I'm right there. I don't know if I've heard that definitively.
I've heard mixed messages on that. I know at one point he wanted one and then he didn't. And I do know that there has been on social media the last day or so some reporting that Trump has canceled some events. He was supposed to be in Savannah to speak at an NRA event, I think, in about a week, and he has backed out of that event. He backed out of a interview with
Backed out of an NRA
CNBC.
event? NRA?
Yes, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, it was supposed to be in Savannah.
Hmm.
And I believe he also backed out of another interview recently. I don't know. There is some speculation this might be related to the I don't know if everyone here is aware of it, but there was what a lot of people characterize as a bizarre appearance by Trump at an event earlier this week at a forum where rather than answering audience questions, he decided to boogie to the oldies, for lack of a better way of expressing it. And they weren't all oldies. It was I think November Rain was one of the songs that was featured, which, I can appreciate some eclectic taste, so some Pavarotti and some November Rain, but and so there is some speculation perhaps that maybe the campaign trail is taking it out of him to some degree. But anyway, yeah, and we're sort of in a weird dynamic situation there. But I do, yeah, I'm not sure about the actual situation on the debates. I mean, I suspect at this point probably there's probably not going to be a debate. And maybe we're going to get the information we would normally get from debates from these discussions with individual, podcasters and hosts and things like that. Anyway, so Patience. Oh, sorry.
We have a chat question.
Yeah, Patience did have another follow-up question about the January 6th question. So how likely do we think, or do you think this we're likely to have a repeat of the event of 4 years ago?
That's a great question that I wish you did not have to ask. I don't know if this is a situation where once you remove the seal, it becomes more common. There are two ways of looking at it. This election is not going to be any less contentious than the 2020 election. Again, this is absolutely in no way disrespectful to anyone, especially the Republican Party or its national party platform. These are just facts. Given what happened in 2020, given what had happened before, given the trend, and the fact that he still maintains that 2020 was fraudulent and stolen, I doubt at the end of the night on election night we'll have a projection, but if we did, and it is Kamala Harris winning close, it's not that I think former President Trump will then go and say this was also stolen. I think he would claim victory, like he did in 2020. So if that happens again, that could put into place the right chemicals to lead to another January 6th insurrection. But there's a big difference this time. In 2020, President Trump was president on January 6th. If this happened in 2024 or 2025, January 6th, you will have President Biden as president. And he would be, I think, much more proactive and aggressive with security forces, with tapping into the DC police, National Guard. I think you would have a much, much more secure situation. Not to mention, if anyone's paying attention to those who took part in that insurrection and who raided the Capitol, Um, the vast majority of them were indicted by federal grand juries. They've gone to court or they've pled out, and they are sitting in a federal prison right now. So when you look at what happened on January 6th, those who were able, those who we were able to identify, those most of them, many of them are right now in a federal prison. So it was not successful. I think a lot of people, having seen that the January 6th insurrection was not successful, while they might talk about it, they might want to. Maybe this is me being hopeful, but I think the catastrophe that was the January 6th insurrection, I think that leads a lot of people in the future to say, let's don't do that again because that was clearly stupid. This was not the storming of the Bastille here. This was a criminal act, possibly treasonous, that did not succeed in putting President Trump back in the White House for the next 4 years. And a lot of the people who took part are in federal prison right now. So it wasn't successful. So I'm thinking the lack of success from the January 6th insurrection might lead a lot of people who might feel like doing that to not do it. Not to mention there will be a hell of a lot more security. Um, with that being said, hopefully it doesn't occur.
Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. I think that, like you said, I mean, I think probably, obviously there's going to be much more of a deterrent effect. Obviously, people are going to be prepared this time around for something like that. And I think also that, you know, I mean, I think that to some extent, in 2000, in the last time in 2021. I mean, I think there was more of a reluctance to use, as you suggested before in your previous answer, that there was a reluctance to use force against protesters. That perhaps because perhaps because of the surprise element, perhaps because of um, frankly, there is some evidence that there were some people that were sympathetic to the goals of the protesters among the people that were supposed to be defending the Capitol. My suspicion is many of those people no longer have jobs, although I certainly can't prove it. But I think there is the deterrent effect of, hey, a lot of the people that did this last time are in jail, are in prison. Um, Many of the people that would be inclined to do it again are in prison. So have you kind of skimmed off the militant element that was willing to do this sort of thing in the first place anyway, right? Yeah, there's probably a few people out there that are still that they didn't catch or that didn't participate last time that might be inclined to participate again this time. But I do think that the elements are not quite there. And of course, as you suggest, also right, the Biden administration is also probably going to be much more proactive in responding if something does happen, and not sort of dilly dallying with sending out the National Guard and all that sort of thing. Um, and again, we do have the demonstration effect also of what happened last time, and so people are going to say, well, that was bad. Let's not have that happen again. Just as I think the risk, if anything, is an overreaction, right? Where something that isn't violent becomes violent because somebody on the other side decide get spooked or that sort of thing, right? We've seen this with other sorts of protests in the past where people that were not violent were confronted law enforcement and something happened and a bunch of protesters end up dead. And that's not a good thing either. But I think they may err on the side of caution more this time around, and that may not, there's a there, you know, I don't think I don't think anything good can come of something this time around. So maybe, hopefully, saner heads will prevail and not try to escalate anything in the first place, I would say. Or if they're going to do something, do it far away from the Capitol, because I do think that people are going to um, regard that as a much more sensitive area than perhaps they did 4 years ago. So we have one last question. Um, so on the campaign trail, both Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have proposed several trade and tax policy changes. What would the likely impact of these changes be if they are elected and able to implement them?
Again, great question. And this is a question that is impossible to do in 10 minutes, but I'm going to try my best. I'll start with the impacts first. Let's look at the economics. If you look at the overall policies that are being espoused by Vice President Kamala Harris, former President Trump, both would add to the national debt. Over the next 10 years, the estimate for Kamala Harris's policies would be about $1 trillion. Over 10 years for former President Trump, it would be $5 trillion. There's a reason why President Trump's policies would be projected to add $5 trillion instead of $1 trillion like Kamala Harris, because his involve an enormous number of tax cuts, particularly targeting more of the wealthy population, the top quintile. Having said that, in terms of impacts, I'll just run through some of Vice President Kamala Harris's as fast as I can. She has been quite vocal, and this is understandable after the coronavirus-induced and stimulus-induced, although necessary stimulus, inflation that we have just suffered through, and we're actually recovering from now. If you've been out on the market looking at houses recently, I take a sense of humor with you, because the housing market has dramatically shifted. Houses are shockingly too expensive. Average pay is nowhere near enough to afford the exact same kind of lifestyle that our grandparents or our parents would have experienced. This could be temporary. This needs to be fixed. But Kamala Harris has spoken a great deal about making housing more affordable. Now, at this point, you want to stop and ask the vice president, how does the president of the United States make housing more affordable? There are many tools that they have. One in particular would be federal incentives to increase the housing supply, to build more. And that would also spur the economy. She wants to lower the cost of childcare. That's something that has been part of her campaign for quite a while. She wants to crack down on price gouging. That's another difficult element there, because first and foremost, price gouging is already illegal in all 50 states. How the federal government would impact that, she has not yet told us how that would happen. Cracking down on price gouging, I wouldn't say that's a policy goal of her future administration. Everyone wants that. She also wants to continue what the Biden administration has done, aggressive legislation that was successfully passed in the first 2 years of his first term, wants to reduce prescription drug costs. President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, among many other things, set a precedent by allowing Medicare to negotiate with drug companies over the cost of medications. Allowing Medicare to negotiate with drug companies is huge. History might look back on the Biden administration and identify this as one of the most important things he did. That allows to lower costs. Every other nation state in the world does do this already. We do not, and Medicare involves a large number of Americans. So that's a big reduction tool in the cost. The Biden administration has already lowered the cost of, I believe, insulin. So that's a policy objective. She wants to sign a federal right to abortion bill, but that would be Congress's responsibility to get that to her. Expanding the child tax credit to $6,000, where it's currently, I believe, at $2,000. A lot of these policies mirror the Trump administration. Former President Trump wants to expand the child tax credit to $5,000. Kamala Harris wants to expand it to $6,000. I don't think that extra thousand is accidental. She's also, interestingly, this isn't something she's constitutionally committed to if she wins. She has said on several occasions that she will appoint a Republican to her cabinet, which is something that is quite rare recently. I'm sure there have been others, but the last I can think of would have been Colin Powell, Secretary of Defense for Bill Clinton. There might have been some others that were in the different party, but in the cabinet. So that's interesting. She wants to raise taxes. This is a big one. She wants to raise taxes on big businesses and Americans making over $400,000 a year. The Trump administration would lower taxes across the board, kind of mostly for the wealthiest quintile. Raising taxes on big businesses and Americans making over $400,000 a year would be one of the key features of her administration. That would be her dream. That would be something she would have to have a Democratic majority in the House, and possibly a filibuster-proof supermajority in the Senate, which she's not going to have. So that'll be difficult. In terms of foreign policy, she has vowed several times to defend and support Ukraine and not allow the Russian aggression to topple a liberal democracy. Now, jumping over to President Trump, obviously he wants to expand his 2017 tax cuts. Many elements of the 2017 tax cuts are expiring, or if they've already expired. a matter of the last few days, there were several tax cuts that were for the wealthy, that were for corporations, that were permanent. Tax cuts from the Trump administration's 2017 tax cut on middle class Americans are expiring. He wants to expand on that. One major element of his campaign involves undocumented immigrants. He has said, he's actually promised, if he's elected, the largest mass deportation in U.S. history. We would be looking at the possibility of millions of undocumented immigrants. And this is an issue that has multiple sides. On the one hand, you do have to have, if you're going to be a sovereign nation state, you have to control your borders. Having said that, it is a champagne problem that you are a nation state that so many people want to come to. And the undocumented immigrants in the country now, which exceed easily 10 million, if they were all removed today, the economy would probably crash. They're integrated into the economy. So cracking down on illegal immigration, that's a major element of President Trump's campaign. Another big one, and this one is hard to stay, I'm gonna try to stay surgical here. He wants to impose dramatically increased tariffs on imports coming in from around the world. Now, to get why this might be problematic, you're going to need to know a little bit about the last 100 or so years of the global economy, the growth of the market economy, the expansion of free market capitalism, to use the most simplistic term, the direction of the planet, especially the globalized era post-Cold War, is one of lowering barriers to economic trade. One of the central features of a market economy is to lower government-imposed barriers. So there are very few experts on either side of the aisle that you can find that will guarantee dramatically increasing tariffs not harming the economy. That's probably the most controversial element of President Trump's possible administration, the tariffs. The other day, I literally saw him talking. This was at an event, and he said that he was going to, if he's elected, he guaranteed this. He promised he was going to raise tariffs on John Deere by, I think he said 200%, because there's a John Deere factory that's moving out of the nation. So tariffs are a tricky area. At first, they sound like they make sense, protect American industry, but we don't live in that world anymore. There is no economic isolationism anymore. If we raise tariffs on other nations, it just increases the price of products in this country, and it forces other nations to raise tariffs on our exports. That's one of the more controversial elements. He wants to roll back President Biden's clean energy plans. There are many of them. He has also said, and this juxtaposes Kamala Harris, who says she will continue to support Ukraine. He has said that he will end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. Now, as much as we would all love the war in Ukraine to be ended in 24 hours, he hasn't given any concrete plans for that, but he is definitely has been aggressive with his assertions that he will be able to bring foreign policy success regarding Ukraine that no one else could. He has also mentioned a desire to cut funding to any public schools who take part in critical race theory or transgender matters, as he said. That's tricky because the lion's share of public education comes from state and local governments anyway. He also wants to have no taxes on Social Security income. That's something that's very popular. Obviously, he wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and he has concepts of a plan. And he's also claimed that he would like to lower interest rates. The presidents don't control the Federal Reserve, so that would be tricky. So both Kamala Harris and former President Trump have a number of policy goals. Some of them mirror one another. Some of them are bipolar, and many of them, neither one has a concrete plan for. I just noticed it's 5:29, and I should probably stop talking, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. But again, both candidates have a large variety of policies, some that are similar, some vastly different. And we will see in early November which one will have the opportunity.
Okie dokie, great. So we have just rolled into 5:30. Just a couple of brief things. So the 2017 tax cuts are going to expire, I think, next year. So, and either party, whoever's in charge, is going to have to deal with that along with Congress. So, we're definitely going to see some sort of big tax bill, tax legislation although we'll probably also see a big tax bill sometime next year. Let's see. So I'd like to thank everybody for coming out and joining us today, and taking time out of your busy schedule. Our next event is going to be on Monday, the 28th of October. So not this coming Monday, but a week from Monday at 4 o'clock. And we're going to be discussing global events, a lot of global events going on around the world, including actually today, apparently the assassination of the leader of Hamas. So we will definitely be talking about, I'm sure, the consequences and fallout from that. And then also in a couple weeks after that, on the 11th of November, which happens to be Veterans Day, we will be discussing the outcome of the 2024 elections and some prognostication on that. And we'll be joined for both those events by a couple of colleagues. So it will not just be the Dr. Hall and Dr. Lawrence show, but the more the merrier. Not to say that not having the more the merrier is a problem, but we expect to have, in addition, Dr. Hall will have Dr. Matchrock and Dr. Caverly on the global issues discussion, and then Dr. Caverly will also be joining us for the post-election discussion, as well as Dr. Adam Squares. So we're going to have a pretty full house for those. If you're interested in reviewing this later, or if you know other people that want to watch it, our recording will be available on our YouTube page probably sometime tomorrow, maybe early next week, depending on when I'm able to get it all downloaded and uploaded and all that good stuff. It has to be edited a little bit, but just to cut out the very beginning and things like that. So it takes a little bit of time, but hopefully that'll be posted certainly in the next few days. So, and you can find all of our past events on youtube.com/@ MGA Pulsi, MGAPOLSCI. And we'd like to thank everybody for joining us. I'd like to thank our people that had questions, Patience and Joseph in particular, and those of you that attended as well. And hope everybody has a good evening and a good weekend. And we will see you all hopefully in about a week and a half for our global issues discussion. Thank you all, and good night and good luck.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody.